Hello there. Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, the US and Russia talking about Ukraine without Ukraine. We'll talk to a top expert about this emerging peace process.
And the New York mayor's corruption case becomes a major headache for Trump's Justice Department. But first,
US and Russian officials have been meeting in Saudi Arabia to discuss the war in Ukraine. These are the highest level talks since the Russian invasion almost exactly 3 years ago. Ukraine wasn't invited, nor were the European powers supporting them. They held separate talks in Paris. The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, saying that without him, these talks were meaningless. President Trump, though, says that Ukraine will be involved, and he thinks that Russia's Vladimir Putin is ready to end this conflict.
I think he wants to stop fighting. They have a big, powerful machine, you understand that. And they defeated Hitler and they defeated Napoleon. You know, they've been fighting a long time. They've done it before. And but I think he'd like this. I think he would like to stop fighting.
Do you think he wants the whole of Ukraine, or just what do you think he wants?
No, I think he wants to stop. That was my question to him, because if he's going to go on, that would have been a big problem for us.
An even bigger problem for Ukraine. Meanwhile, US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth dropped some truth bombs last week when he preempted these peace talks with some major concessions.
We must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective.
So forget about getting Crimea back.
The United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement.
Okay, so that's off the table too. Anything else?
There will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine.
Right. And while withholding American forces, Hegseth also said that any security guarantee or peacekeeping force will not be a NATO mission, as it was in Bosnia and Kosovo. Danish Defence Minister Troels Lund Poulsen this week warning of new intelligence that within a 3 to 5 year period, Russia will test Article 5 and NATO's solidarity, by which he meant invade a NATO country, and in doing so, test Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which states an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all, and members will take such action as they deem necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain security. Ever since it was signed in 1949, that's been seen as a mutual defence guarantee. Attack a NATO member and the rest will come to their aid. And that's why Ukrainian membership in NATO is problematic while it's still occupied by Russia. And if push comes to shove, would America now go to war with Russia to defend Estonia, a NATO member, or another, Poland? America under Donald Trump is now being seen as an unreliable ally, keen to withdraw many of their existing 100,000 troops from Europe and shift their military focus to Asia and their economic commitments to America. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky telling last week's Munich Security Conference that Europe needs to build an army of their own now to counter the threat from Russia.
Let's be honest, now we can't rule out the possibility that America might say no to Europe on issues that threaten it. Many leaders have talked about Europe that needs its own military, an army of Europe. And
honestly, I don't know what's happening, John, because while Pete Hegseth did make all kinds of pronouncements about what was off the table for Ukraine, well, the very next day, someone reset the table.
I want to be clear about something as it pertains to NATO membership not being realistic outcome for negotiations. That's something that was stated as part of my remarks here, as part of a coordination with how we're executing these ongoing negotiations, which are led by President Trump. All of that said, these negotiations are led by President Trump. Everything is on the table in his conversations with Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. What he decides to allow or not allow is at the purview of the leader of the free world, of President Trump.
Yep, now everything's on the table and it's all up to Trump. Having said that, I do agree that the signs are not great for Ukraine right now. In particular, look who Trump's got negotiating for him with Russia. He's got the Secretary of State, the CIA Director, the National Security Advisor, and the Mideast Envoy, but he doesn't have Keith Kellogg, his envoy for Russia and Ukraine. That seems kind of relevant. And that presumably is because Kellogg isn't much of a fan of Russia. He's Trump's most pro-Ukraine official, so they disappeared him. Not a good sign for Ukraine at all. And given that Trump excluded Ukraine from the peace talks, someone asked him whether he considered Ukraine to be an equal partner in peace at all. And Trump's answer, while unusually diplomatic, was very clear.
Do you view Ukraine as an equal member of this peace process?
It's an interesting question. I think they have to make peace. Their people are being killed, and I think they have to make peace. I said that was not a good war to go into, and I think they have to make peace. That's what I think.
Note also how he seemed there to be blaming Ukraine for getting invaded. So, in summary, Trump has dealt Ukraine out of the negotiations. He doesn't regard them as an equal partner for peace. He believes that they somehow chose this war, and he's removed the negotiator who would best represent them. Ukraine is in strife. And as John said, Europe has also been excluded from the talks, even though Trump seems to expect them to enforce the agreement that he brokers without them. Of course, Europe should be able to take Russia easily, you'd think. Their population is much bigger than Russia's, and add the UK in there, and the difference is enormous. Also, Europe's combined industrial capacity dwarfs Russia's. Russia is only the 5th biggest manufacturing economy in the region. Finally, Europe spends so much more on defence. Russia only spends $145 billion on defence compared to Europe's $457 billion. But here's the thing, when you consider how much cheaper Russia's domestic inputs are than Europe's, Russia's actually spending effectively $460 billion a year. In other words, John, Russia's actually outspending the entirety of Europe on defence. Combined, I'm talking about here. And this is Trump and Hegseth's point. Europe needs to get cracking.
Yeah, I think maybe defence isn't quite the word for what Russia is doing with their military, but still. After this morning's talks, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov wrapped up, Rubio was very much focusing in a press briefing on the potential economic dividends of peace as a part of a 4-point diplomatic plan. And he was also pretty keen to heap praise on his boss back in Washington, D.C., knowing that Donald Trump's ego is one of the many variables in this particular equation.
Is the only leader in the world who can make this happen, who can even bring people together to begin to talk about it in a serious way, is President Trump. He's the only one in the world that can do that right now. The second thing I would say is that in order for a conflict to end, everyone involved in that conflict has to be okay with it. It has to be acceptable to them.
And Chaz, if there is any remaining doubt at all that Donald Trump is blaming Ukraine for starting this war by being invaded, here is what he said after those talks in Riyadh.
And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
Well, for more, we're joined by Dr. Angela Stent, Russia expert, author of books including Putin's World, professor at Georgetown University, who's also served in the US State Department and the National Intelligence Council. Dr. Stent, welcome. First of all, in your view, was it a miscalculation for the United States to proceed with these talks with Russia without Ukraine or the Europeans? Because clearly Zelensky feels he's about to be presented with some kind of fait accompli.
So I think having a US-Russian meeting, President Trump is sending Putin a message which President Trump supports, which is the main point of all of this, is to restore proper diplomatic relations with Russia in political contacts, economic contacts, lift sanctions. In other words, restore the US-Russian relationship as it was probably quite a long time ago, but particularly before the war began. And in that sense, the Europeans and the Ukrainians aren't key to this. I think ending the war in Ukraine is another goal of the Trump administration because they don't want to have to give any more money to Ukraine and because President Trump would like to get the Nobel Peace Prize, so he'd like to end the war. And in that sense, they really do have to coordinate with Europe and Ukraine. And I think excluding them a priori and telegraphing them that to them before the talks even began, it just sends a message to Russia that this is about a US-Russian deal and that Europe and Ukraine are much less important.
Dr. Stent, if Europe doesn't like the deal that Trump strikes with Putin, can they feasibly keep the war going on their own?
it's probably impossible to do that, because if there's no US military or financial assistance forthcoming, I mean, the Europeans had their own meeting in Brussels on Monday, the 17th, where they tried to hammer out what they could do to beef up their own military sector and how they could support Ukraine more. But they just don't have the wherewithal to give the Ukrainians what they need, at least militarily, to keep on fighting this war, even though financially they've just pledged some more assistance to them. So I think it would be very difficult for them to keep supporting Ukraine in this war if there is no US input.
And ultimately, how much do you expect the United States will be wanting Ukraine to give away in return for peace and security beyond Crimea?
So essentially, they're articulating what the Putin plan is, that Ukraine's borders, as they were before 2014, before Russia annexed Crimea, will not be restored anytime soon. NATO membership is certainly off the table for the time being. They haven't said it's off the table forever. And they've said that there will be no US troops involved in peacekeeping forces and maintaining the peace if there is an agreement. And I think that it would be very hard for the Ukrainians to refuse to accept these conditions, because otherwise that would mean that they, again, as we said, would have to go on fighting with European help maybe, but without US help. And so the big question about what Secretary Hegseth and J.D. Vance have put on the table, also Secretary Rubio, is what's Russia giving up in return for this? It seems to me not much. Russia doesn't even control all of the 4 territories that it claims to have occupied, and Ukraine's going to have to cede those to Russia. And so, as I say, I see nothing from the Russian side at the moment that looks like a compromise.
Dr. Stent, how much do you think Russia needs this ceasefire? Or can they realistically keep fighting this war for years yet?
So Putin is not interested in ending the war. What he's interested in is precisely what he seems to be getting, which is a restoration of relations with the US, the end of Western isolation of Russia, Russia again recognized as a great power all around the world. He believes Russia's winning this war, and militarily on the battlefield, they are incrementally doing better than they were before, even though they're losing up to 1,000 men a day in this. So there's really no incentive for him at the moment to stop fighting. People believe that probably by next year, by 2026, the Russian economy will feel more of the pinch of being on a war economy footing, and fiscal policies and monetary policies, not being very effective. And that may put more constraints on Russia's ability to continue this war. But as I say, I do not believe that at the moment Putin particularly has any interest in ending the war, and Russia can go on fighting. The Russians outnumber the Ukrainians. Both Russia and Ukraine are having problems recruiting soldiers, but the Russians have more options than the Ukrainians do.
Dr. Angela Stent, thank you for joining us on Planet America.
Thank you.
Now to what's fast becoming the first major scandal to hit the second Trump administration. The US Justice Department is in turmoil this week, with 7 prosecutors quitting amid allegations of a corrupt bargain to drop criminal charges against New York City's Democratic Mayor Eric Adams. For his part, President Trump says these resignations ain't no big thing.
These are mostly people from the previous administration, you understand, so they weren't going to be there anyway. They were going to all be gone or dismissed. If not, they know on Tuesday they're all being dismissed. The whole country is being, because what you do is you come in and you put new people in. So when you say resign, they're going to be gone anyway. But I know nothing about the individual case.
He knows nothing. So it just didn't come up in conversation when Eric Adams journeyed to Mar-a-Lago in Florida for lunch with Trump just before the inauguration. And even though the Adams case has been major news for months now, Trump, who reportedly watched at least 4 hours of news a day, sometimes twice that in his first term, has simply missed the whole story. Okay, well, in case you're wondering, Adams is facing a slew of corruption charges, including bribery. Prosecutors allege that he took illegal campaign contributions and accepted luxury travel and accommodation, which he solicited and accepted from foreign nationals, including at least one Turkish government official. And sure enough, the Turks soon called in their chits, leading Adams to pressure the New York Fire Department to allow the opening of a Turkish consulate in a Manhattan skyscraper that had not passed a fire inspection. Mayor Adams, who is a former police officer, continues to deny that he's broken any laws.
I didn't do anything wrong. Throughout the entire ordeal, I said one thing. My attorney will handle the legal part. I'm going to handle running the city.
And did you recognise that balding guy sitting right next to Eric Adams? That is Trump's so-called border czar, Tom Homan, who cheerfully threatened Adams on live TV not to break an agreement to allow immigration officials into New York's infamous Rikers Island jail.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to?
And that little aside is a part of the alleged quid pro quo that saw the prosecutors quit. Last week, Acting Attorney General Emile Beauvais directed that the case against Eric Adams be dismissed without prejudice. That means it could be brought back at any time because the decision was also made without assessing the strengths of the evidence or the legal theories. Because, in his view, the charges unduly restricted Mayor Adams' ability to devote his full attention and resources to the illegal immigration and violent crime issues. And that's the implied threat in all of this. Support Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration and violent crime, or, Eric, back come the corruption charges.
I do not know what you're talking about there, John. Didn't you see the footnote on the Deputy Attorney General's memo? It said the government is not offering to exchange dismissal of a criminal case for Adams' assistance on immigration enforcement. There you go. That should put you at ease. There is nothing more reassuring than when people totally out of nowhere explicitly deny wrongdoing.
Yes, this is definitely not a quid pro quo. Well, the acting lead federal prosecutor in this case, Danielle Sassoon, was the first to quit in protest. She didn't believe the footnote either. But far from being some liberal holdover from the last administration, as Trump suggested, she was only appointed 3 weeks ago. She is a member of the Conservative Federalist Society. She used to work for the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who was about as conservative as they come. Sassoon warned that this Adams deal set a, quote, breathtaking and dangerous precedent, one that was tantamount to using the criminal process to control the behaviour of a political figure.
Yeah, Sassoon also noted that during a meeting that she'd had with Deputy Attorney General Beauvais and Eric Adams' counsel, who, by the way, also has ties to Trump, she said that Adams' attorneys repeatedly urged what amounted to a quid pro quo, indicating that Adams would be in a position to assist with the department enforcement priorities only if the indictment was dismissed. And so Beauvais went off at them. That is, he went off at the member of Sassoon's team taking notes of those offers. And then he collected those notes from them at the end of the meeting. Nothing sus about that at all. And it's no wonder Sassoon wasn't keen to dismiss the case. Turns out that she was about to file a superseding indictment that would add another count of obstruction conspiracy based on evidence that Adams destroyed and instructed others to destroy evidence and provide false information to the FBI. So she definitely felt like she had the goods on him. Everything about this clemency stinks. At one point, Deputy Attorney General Beauvais tore into Sassoon for what he called your choice to continue pursuing a politically motivated prosecution. When literally, remember, only 3 days earlier he'd written that he hadn't assessed the strength of the evidence or the legal theories on which the case is based, and that this directive in no way calls into question the integrity and efforts of the line prosecutors responsible for this case. So he seemed pretty confused to me there, and he also seemed willing to say anything that he needed to say to get Adams off the hook. Not that it worked. First, Sassoon quit in protest. Then Beauvais moved the case to the Public Integrity section of the Department of Justice, and the acting head of that section also resigned in protest. So then they sent the case to DOJ's Criminal Division, where its acting head also refused to drop the case and resigned in protest. Then the 3 other deputies in the Public Integrity section also resigned in protest, and then the lead prosecutor in Adams' case also resigned in protest. Deputy Attorney General Beauvais eventually had to gather the entire Public Integrity section of the Justice Department together. We're talking about 30 people here, and he threatened all of them. They'd fire anyone unwilling to dismiss the case against Adams, and he'd give them 1 hour to come up with a name that would file his motion. One guy about to retire decided to take the assignment just to save everyone else's jobs. really wasn't an edifying process at all. The only person who seemed to respect it was Eric Adams.
So I thank the Justice Department for its honesty.
Yeah, right. Honesty. By the way, John, Adams shouldn't get too cocky there because the Deputy Attorney General might have found that lawyer to do his dirty work. But Adams's judge has to agree that dismissing the charges is in the public interest, or those charges stick and the case goes on. So we're all going to be awaiting that decision rather eagerly from that court, I reckon. The only other question left is the Governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, going to sack Adams? She has the power to sack him anytime she wants. But Adams is a political ally of hers, John, and also this whole situation is placing her under extreme pressure. Her hand-picked Lieutenant Governor has already undermined her by calling for Adams to resign. The Chief Democrat in the House, Hakeem Jeffries, has also questioned Adams' political future. 4 of Adams' deputy mayors have also resigned. And adding to the pressure, Hochul's rival, Andrew Cuomo, is expected to run for mayor if Hochul clears the way for him. So this scandal is sucking everyone into the vortex.
Sure is. And just 3 or 4 years ago, people were saying Eric Adams could be President of the United States one day. America's commitment to the global response against HIV and AIDS was one of the few bipartisan programs left until now. The Trump administration's decision to freeze foreign aid means that funding for HIV programs is now very much in question, potentially endangering millions of lives. With more, here's Melina Wicks in the briefing room.
USAID, the government agency that distributes aid around the world, has had a bit of a shake-up lately.
And just like that, down came the lettering at the headquarters of the U.S. Agency for International Development in Washington, a key target in President Donald Trump's cost-cutting spree.
As we dug into USAID, it became apparent that what we have here is not an apple with a worm in it, but we have actually just a bowl of worms.
They need to go to a better supermarket. Musk and his allies are having a lot of fun with some of the agency's more questionable projects.
$20 million for Iraqi Sesame Street, $2 million for Moroccan pottery classes, $11 million to tell Vietnam to stop burning trash.
$20 million does sound like a lot to pay a monster that lives in the garbage. But critics of USAID are less keen to talk about the many life-saving projects that the organisation supports, which includes one of the most successful global health programs of all time. I'm talking about PEPFAR. No, that's the PEP podcast. We're not allowed to talk about that anymore. Thank you. PEPFAR is the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief, a hugely ambitious project spearheaded by George Bush in 2003. It's the largest commitment a country has ever made to combating a single disease, and it's had transformative results. The program is credited with saving 26 million lives and enabling 7.8 million babies to be born HIV-free. That's incredible. But weeks into Trump's funding freeze, that work was still in doubt, putting the health of 20 million people who rely on the program in jeopardy, including 500,000 children. The State Department issued a 90-day waiver saying parts of the PEPFAR program, like testing and treatment, could continue. But there were still reports of people being turned away from clinics. Secretary of State Marco Rubio smelled a rat.
If some organization is receiving funds from the United States and does not know how to apply a waiver, then I have real questions about the competence of that organization. Or I wonder whether they're deliberately sabotaging it for purposes of making a political point.
That's very cynical. Who hurt you, Marco? Oh, yeah. This isn't the first time PEPFAR has come under threat. Back in 2023, a standard 5-year reauthorization became unexpectedly controversial.
Representative Chris Smith is accusing the program of indirectly funding abortions. This has angered lawmakers, alarmed advocates, and worried partners overseas.
The program that saved 26 million lives was accused of being insufficiently pro-life. To be clear, using PEPFAR money to fund abortions is already illegal. But the mere accusation meant PEPFAR was only renewed for 1 year instead of the usual 5. That means it'll be back up for review this year, with its future yet again thrown into doubt. To be fair, Trump is giving Americans what they want. A majority support cutting foreign aid, and that's their right. But let's not treat a program that millions of lives depend on as if it's
Iraqi Sesame Street.
Now, you might recall on Inauguration Day, the new president made some big promises.
Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
Well, this week we learned a little bit more about what that means with easily Trump's most consequential policy of the new term. It's what Trump calls the fair and reciprocal plan. He signed an executive order to counter non-reciprocal trading arrangements. That means America will impose a different reciprocal tariff for every foreign trading partner. And each of those tariffs is going to be determined by adding up all the measures that disadvantage the United States from that country, whether they're written down or not. So these are going to be very specific tariffs imposed on very specific countries based on their very specific levels of protection. To put it simply, if a country taxes cars made in America at a rate of 10%, say, then America will impose the same 10% tax on cars imported from that country. So this is very different to Trump's tariffs until now, which were across-the-board tariffs. Even if you're not a tariff fan, which I'm not, you might appreciate that this is more of a scalpel approach to trade policy rather than a chainsaw. In fact, it's possible that in the case of some countries, American tariffs could be reduced to match those countries' lower tariffs on US products. I guess the question is, how detailed are these calculations going to be? Just one general tariff for each country, or one tariff for every product from every country? Because the American tariff schedule has about 13,000 line items, and there are roughly 200 countries trading those 13,000 line items. So America could potentially be considering 13,000 times 200 equals 2.6 million individual tariff rates. We'll find out. Either way, Trump is seeing dollar signs, claiming America could raise $1 trillion in new annual revenue from this measure. Although that does seem unlikely, seeing as America only imported $3.3 trillion worth of goods last year. So to raise $1 trillion in tariffs from $3 trillion worth of goods, you'd need to set the rate so high that you'd severely reduce imports and thus tariff revenue. Either way, for Trump, there is a very simple message. If you build the product in the United States, there are no tariffs. He says he's just doing what's fair. Well, probably not true, because many products manufactured in America also use components and materials from overseas anyway. But whatever, Trump's main point is that countries like, say, South Korea, that impose an average of 13.6% tariffs on US goods, while the US only imposes 1.9% on South Korean goods, well, they'd better watch out, because Trump is gunning for them. Anyway, Trump has finally got his tariff regime. Now all he needs is the merchandise.
It's this year's coolest toy. Trade Wars action figures with Donald Trump as Obi-Wan Filoni, J.D. Vance as Luke Eyeliner, and Elon Musk as Orlando Calrissian. With ambiguous arm-swinging action, our heroes team up with an old Mexican fentanyl smuggler, Juan Solo, and his extremely hairy friend, Chew Bannon. They must fight the most unpopular figure in the galaxy, Jar Jar Justin Trudeau. Me speak a little French. And save Princess Lara. Help me, Obi-Wan. You're my only hope for a job. Trade Wars action figures. Get yours for just $20 plus tariffs. Stormy Troopers are adults only and sold separately.
What's about the merchandise with you? What is that? Until the time we have for another trip to Planet America. We'll see you back here at the same time next week and anytime you like from 9 p.m. on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
Cheeky. And don't forget Planet America's Weekend Edition, Friday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Summer Time on ABC News. Also on iView and online. See you there.
Bye-bye.